Thank you. I'm gonna have to. I can hide behind it. That way, if you throw things, I'm safe. Okay. Yes, the story of my life. Okay. Well, thank you for having me and for all of you coming. A number of years ago, Mark Marnier asked me to write the History of Cartography, Volume 6 entry on women in the 20th century. Second half of the century presented absolutely no problems. World War II and all of the mapping equivalents to Rosie the Riveter, and after the war, the rise of academic cartography. There were lots of women cartographers and many well known. But the period before 1935 was essentially a frustrating blank. Recently, I have found 4 pioneers who were well known in their time, but have faded into obscurity. One of the women I discovered after I sent the abstract for this paper, so the abstract says 3 women pioneers, but I decided to add her after all. I've referred to women cartographers as hidden, but I'm not suggesting they were deliberately erased from histories of cartography. Rather, I believe that it's because of the kinds of maps that they made and where they worked that make them hidden. Until quite recently, historians and collectors haven't been interested in such things as educational maps or pictorial maps or city maps. And in many cases, especially with ones like pictorial maps, these weren't even considered real maps because they were outside of the scientific canon. Collectors tended to focus on pre-19th century maps. And while there were some women cartographers pre-19th century, there weren't quite as many. But in addition, the focus has been on the major publishing houses or the history of mapping agencies, not on the people, whether male or female. They don't get discussed that much. Most of us could name Mercator or Hondius, but not much beyond that. This is changing. We've seen some here in these sessions on individual cartographers. In many cases, the women that I'm looking at today were quite well known in their time, but not now. Okay? And I want you to keep in mind when we look at the maps that these women all worked with pen and ink on paper. And the lettering was done freehand, no templates, just a pen. All right. First, we have to get the technology working. Okay. Our first cartographer is Grace Raymond Hebard. She is the first of the group today, chronologically. She is primarily well known as a historian of the American West. In fact, many of her books are still in print and even available for Kindle or for Nook. However, Grace Hebard had her beginnings as a map draftsman, the title of the time, and she continued to make maps throughout her career. She was born in Iowa, and she obtained a degree in civil engineering in 1882, which was a little unusual for the time. Her degree was from the University of Iowa, where she took courses in mechanical drafting and surveying. She was the first woman in engineering and the only woman in her class. She recalled her experiences at the university later. I met with many discouragements and many sneers and much opposition to my enrolling in the scientific course, which was then entirely a men's college. All kinds of discouraging predictions were made that I would fail, that it was impossible for a woman to do the kind of work I was undertaking. Hebard moved to Wyoming after graduation, and she took a job at the United States Surveyor General's office in Cheyenne, in what was at that time Wyoming Territory. She was the only female drafter among 46 who were employed there. She ultimately became the deputy state engineer, which ironically led to a pay cut. By 1889, the state had reached the point where the mapping of the Wyoming Territory was complete. and Hebard's employment came to an end. But she had planned ahead. Okay. These here. Running just through some of these. While working as a map draftsman, she obtained a master's degree in English literature from the University of Iowa by correspondence. And she received that in 1885. In 1891, she moved from Cheyenne to Laramie to take a position as secretary to and member of the Board of Trustees of the newly formed University of Wyoming. She founded the university library and worked as an unpaid university librarian from 1894 to 1919. In 1893, she earned, again by correspondence, a PhD in political economy from Illinois Wesleyan and obtained a faculty appointment at the University of Wyoming. In 1904, she began publishing books on the history of the West, including books on the Bozeman Trail and Sacagawea, among other trails. She was quite a traveler and went out and plotted these. The books were all illustrated with her own maps. These two maps that I have shown are of her, from her books. This last one, it is 28, it's copyrighted by her. It has, it does have her name on it, that it's by Grace Hebard, but there's also a man's name attached to it, and I'm not quite sure, who did what. But given the looks of her other maps, I suspect he may have done the pictorial elements on this, but I haven't been able to figure that out yet. Okay, this is another of her maps from a 1932 book. She was quite prolific. Okay. There are some who have criticized her work as a historian, and they say that her work on the critics that her work on Sacagawea was perhaps colored a bit by her feelings and not quite as accurate as it should be. But her maps are quite good examples of their time, and I haven't heard much criticism of them. Laura Whitlock was an interesting woman. As with most of these women, I have found her by, I would love to say, good scholarship, but mostly it has been dumb luck. Hebard, a colleague, said, "Hey, have you heard of?" Okay. And someone else found a little blurb about this woman and found out that she was quite an interesting person in my own area. This is Laura Whitlock, a very prim and proper-looking lady. She worked in the first 2 decades of the 20th century as a map publisher and the official cartographer for the city of Los Angeles. She is cited as the only female map publisher of the time. Most of the earlier map publishers had inherited the firm from a husband or father. She was independent. Laura was born in Iowa, but she lived in Burlington, Vermont, and also in York and Omaha, Nebraska. She worked as a music teacher and as a cashier at various companies after her family moved to Los Angeles, which was either the late 80s or the early 90s, 1880s or 1890s. By 1907, she was listed in the city directory as president of the Pacific Coast Travel Club. And in 1910, her occupation was sales lady of maps. She began making and selling maps in 1907. Okay. These aren't the best quality reproductions, but in 1912, the city directory listed her as official map publisher, and she created the official city map of Los Angeles, as well as the official transportation map and the official map of the Pacific Electric system. That's the Pacific Electric, which was the early version of the metro back in the day when Los Angeles actually had functioning rapid transit. In 1912, the city directly listed her as the official map publisher. Okay. She had an office at the Los Angeles Times building, which was bombed in 1910 and destroyed her printing plates. There were 6 of them. But she was able to redo the maps because she had the tracings kept in a safe deposit box. Okay. At about that time, an unscrupulous map publisher, or map maker in the area, reproduced 20,000 copies of her map and published them. She took him to court and got a federal decision in her favor. It took several years. And during that time, she became somewhat of an expert on copyright law, and she is considered one of the heroes in map copyright protection. This article was a contemporary, more or less contemporary article in Sunset Magazine, a big magazine in the West, about her fight for the copyright and the toll that it took on her. So this was a landmark victory. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find any information about where Laura learned to make maps, where she got her considerable drafting skills, because she's quite good. It's possible that she was one of the schoolgirls who made maps as school projects in the late 19th century, or some have speculated that she became interested in maps when she was working as a map seller, but I have a feeling it came somewhat earlier. Gertrude Brach. You'll notice I don't have a photograph of Gertrude. I have been looking and have not had any luck. Gertrude was the daughter of a Sooner and worked in Oklahoma, as you would expect. She was the cartographer for the Oklahoma Department of Transportation, where she made highway maps for, among other things, the newly created Route 66. She designed and executed the first state highway department map that was a 7-foot by 12-foot map, complete with all data of highway constructions, the names of all the towns, the cities, the rivers, the streams, and a mileage chart. It was framed and it was mounted behind glass and lighted in cities, towns, chambers of commerce, and the like. Probably her best known map, though, is this one. Main Street of America, Route 66, approximately 1926. Again, I found Gertrude serendipitously. I was doing some research on Route 66. I have a thing for highways. And I was at an exhibit at the Autry Museum in Los Angeles, and I'm looking at all the old gas station pumps and things like that. And here on the wall is this map, and I look down in the corner, and it says Gertrude Bracht. It's not a name that's usually unisex sort of name. So I found her. The Mother Road, not only shows the route, as you can see, but it also shows a profile. Now, reflecting Irwin Royce's quote about prominent names on the map often being the people least involved in its making, we can note that on a lot of the highway maps, people who are named prominently are members of the State Highway Commission, including the state highway engineer, and at the very bottom, in small type, let's see if this is on, we have Gertrude Bracht's name. Gertrude did something else that earned her some notoriety. She was appointed, Oklahoma's first highway beautification engineer. This was back in 1933. Okay? And notices appeared as far away as San Bernardino in newspapers, and this is it. There are also some somewhat sarcastic cartoons, I haven't been able to track any down in person, that appeared in a lot of newspapers that showed lampposts with frilly shades and highway markers in Old English script and sashes for long-waisted trees, showing the novelty of the feminine approach to engineering. Gertrude was an active member of the Oklahoma Historical Society until her death in 1972, but I haven't found too much about her personal life so far. Our last woman, and my newest discovery, is Altea Armstrong. She's considered by the Texas General Land Office to be the most prolific draftsperson of the 20th century at the General Land Office. She studied drafting in high school, where she was taunted by a fellow classmate who said that she, as a girl, would never be able to draft better than he. However, she was so good that her teacher recommended her for a position at a local drafting company where she worked for a time before her employment at the Texas General Land Office in 1935. She was responsible for creating some 71 county maps, which at that time were estimated to take 900 hours each. And her maps are very distinctive, as we'll see. Because she was interested in history and had a flair for art, she also decorated the margins of her maps with historical vignettes and landscape sketches. Okay. Here's one of hers, okay, all hand-lettered, the sketches of the area. And this was her last map in 1972. It's not typical of a map from the 1970s, but it is typical of her work. She worked for the GLO for 37 years. She retired in 72 after making this map. And what I find interesting is that the Texas General Land Office now sells reproductions of her maps for $10 to $20. Okay. So, well, in summary, almost out of time. In a sense, there's nothing remarkable about these women. While they certainly created some interesting maps and rather nice maps, and Altea definitely had a remarkable output, they didn't invent any new map types. They didn't write groundbreaking articles on cartographic theory. They didn't create landmark maps, with the possible exception of that Route 66. Why are they worthy of study? Well, to my thinking, to a large extent, it's because they were journeyman cartographers. They were doing the work that many male cartographers did, but at the time their work was unusual for women. All of them were respected in their field. They had some similarities. All four worked in the West: Wyoming, California, Oklahoma, and Texas. Western states were somewhat more open to women in non-traditional jobs. All were born before suffrage. Hebard was actually an active suffragist, and Wyoming granted suffrage in 1890. None of the women were married. In this period, a woman who was married, especially a woman with children, was expected to stay home and fulfill the role of life and mother. And finally, I think all four would probably be considered uppity women who fought for education, for jobs, for suffrage, and even copyright. Thank you.